If you handed most people $100,000, they would see a number. If you handed me $100,000, I would see a machine waiting to be built. That is the difference that changes everything. Most people think financial freedom begins when the number gets big enough. I do not believe that. I think it begins the moment you stop looking at capital as something to admire, protect, fear, or hesitate over, and start looking at it as something that must be arranged, deployed, and allowed to work. That is the hook. That is the whole idea. And if you miss it, then even a large sum can sit in your life like a nervous guest, never doing enough to change anything. I have watched this mistake for decades. A man works hard, he saves. He finally gets to $100,000. And instead of a foundation, the number becomes a burden. He stares at it, he worries about losing it, he reads too much, he hesitates too long, he leaves it idle because idle feels safe, or he gets impatient, makes a few emotional decisions, and quietly turns a rare opportunity into a slower version of ordinary life. That is not because $100,000 is small. It is because money in the hands of someone without a system rarely becomes freedom. The first thing I would want you to understand is very simple. Capital is not a possession. It is a system. That line matters more than most people realize. A possession is something you guard. A system is something you design. A possession sits there. A system produces. A possession makes you emotional. A system makes you ask better questions. What is it earning? What is it exposed to? What role does it serve? What happens if I leave it alone? What happens if I interfere? How much friction is draining it? How much tax drag is slowing it? How much of the result depends on my behavior remaining calm? That is how I think about money. That is how I would want you to think about money. And that is very close to the deepest point in the reference you gave me. The source keeps repeating that $100,000 is not a finish line, not a lottery ticket, but the beginning of a compounding system if it is treated correctly. Fay file site, Fay turn 33 file 0 Fay. Now let me make this uncomfortable. Money that is not working is money that is quietly disappearing. People hate that sentence because cash in the bank feels responsible, it feels adult, it feels conservative, it feels like the choice of someone who does not want to be reckless emotionally. I understand that, but arithmetic does not care about emotional tone. Arithmetic only cares about direction. If inflation runs at 3% and your money sits there doing almost nothing, you are not standing still. You are moving backward in slow motion. That is not opinion. That is erosion. The source material puts this very well, almost like physics. Systems left unmanaged deteriorate. Capital left idle is not safe. It is losing purchasing power each year, even if the balance itself looks unchanged. Fay file site, Fay turn 33 file 0 Fay. That is why I do not admire cash for long periods unless it has a job, cash for emergencies, cash for near-term obligations, cash for opportunities not yet visible. Find cash as a permanent emotional hiding place number, because once you understand inflation correctly, you realize something liberating and frightening at the same time. You do not have the option of doing nothing. Doing nothing is already a decision. That is where many people lose the plot. They compare action to inaction as though inaction were neutral. It is not neutral. It is a choice with a cost attached. Once you see that clearly, the whole frame changes. The question is no longer, should I do something with this money? The question becomes, what structure gives this money the best chance to work without me sabotaging it? That brings me to the second force, the one people mention all the time and almost nobody truly respects. Compounding. Everyone loves the word. Very few live in a way that lets the word mean anything. Compounding is not powerful because it sounds intelligent. It is powerful because it turns time into a silent business partner. But compounding has standards. It asks for patience. It asks for consistency. It asks to be left alone longer than your emotions want. It asks you not to reset the machine every time the headlines become theatrical. That is why so many people admire compounding and still never really receive its benefits. They interrupt it, they get excited, they get scared, they chase, they sell, they rearrange, they react. They decide this time is different, they mistake motion for intelligence. The source material says this perfectly. The enemy of compounding is not low returns nearly as much as it is interruption. Every time you panic, chase, restructure emotionally, or reset the clock, you break the thing that was supposed to save you. Fay file site, Fay turn 33 file 0 Fay I have believed that for a long time. People imagine the winning investor is the one who found the hottest thing. Often the winning investor is simply the one who interfered least with a sound structure. Let me say it another way. The majority of great long-term investing results are not built in the dramatic first years. They are built in the dull later years, when the machine is finally large enough that small percentages become serious money. That is why impatience is so expensive. The impatient person keeps killing the tree before it becomes an orchard. In your reference file, there is a useful contrast between two investors starting with the same $100,000. One is active, emotional, opportunistic, always adjusting. The other is methodical, low friction, diversified, and patient. The lesson is not just about return percentages. It is about what friction does, taxes, fees, Mistakes, churn, and emotional interference can destroy far more than people realize. Fay file site Fay turn 33, file 0 Fay. I have seen this all my life. A man thinks he is being engaged. He is actually being expensive. He thinks he is protecting himself. He is often resetting the very thing that needed continuity to become large. That is why I prefer asking one question over and over. If I leave this alone and keep feeding it, where does the line go? That is a Buffett question, not because I worship passivity, because I worship sound trajectory. If a structure is intelligently built, the right instinct is usually not to keep improving it every few weeks. It is to let the structure compound. Now, once we are talking about compounding, we must talk about risk. And here again, most people begin in the wrong place. They think risk is a feeling. They feel nervous, therefore the asset is risky. They feel calm, therefore the asset is safe. They see volatility, therefore danger. They see stability, therefore wisdom. This is how amateurs think. Risk is not a feeling. Risk is a variable. That is one of the best ideas in your source file, and it is completely correct. Real investors do not treat risk as a mood. They treat it as something measurable, calibratable, and designable. The goal is not to eliminate risk. The goal is to understand how much you are taking, why you are taking it, and whether the expected reward justifies it. Fay file site Fay turn 33 file 0 Fay. That is a profound shift, because the moment you start viewing risk as something to be designed rather than feared, you stop behaving like a passenger in your own financial life. A street is risky, you still cross it, you look both ways, you assess. You decide that is how real investing should feel, not fearless, not blind, not frozen, deliberate. If I were managing $100,000, I would immediately ask questions that most people never ask until after they have already made mistakes. How much volatility can I absorb without touching the capital? What allocation lets me sleep without forcing me into cowardice? What combination of growth and stability keeps me from panicking in a downturn? How do I make sure a bad market does not create a forced sale at the worst possible time? What risks am I being paid for? What risks am I volunteering for out of ignorance? That is how operators think. And the source text says this plainly: risk is something you choose and calibrate. Once you understand that, you stop being a passive victim of market behavior and become a designer of exposure. Fay file site Fay turn 33 file 0 Fay. This is why I never mock a person for wanting some stability in the mix. What I do mock is a person who wants reward without paying any price for it. There is always a price if you want higher returns. You usually accept more volatility. If you want total calm, you often accept slower growth. If you want liquidity, you may accept lower yield. If you want safety from forced selling, you keep enough reserve elsewhere. Everything is trade-offs. Mature investing is not about pretending trade-offs do not exist. It is about choosing them consciously. Now, let me go one level deeper, because here is where intelligent people often get embarrassed. The greatest risk in most portfolios is not the market. It is the owner. That sentence offends people because they like to believe their intelligence protects them. Often intelligence simply gives them more complicated reasons to do something foolish. The reference material says this beautifully through the discussion of wrong thinking. Loss aversion, recency bias, emotional interpretation of short-term movements. The tendency to hold losers too long because selling admits pain. The tendency to sell winners too soon because gain feels safer when locked in. The tendency to extrapolate the recent past forever. These are not rare defects. These are standard human settings. Fay file site Fay turn 33 file 0 Fay. That is why I trust rules more than moods. The person who builds rules in calm weather and follows them in rough weather has a huge advantage over the person who believes he will simply be wise in the moment. He usually will not. None of us are as rational in the moment as we imagine in advance. So if I were running this $100,000 properly, I would want written rules. What is my target allocation? How often do I rebalance? What percentage deviation forces a rebalance? What is this money for? What is not allowed? What counts as an emergency? What rate of loss can occur without changing the plan? What would actually justify a structural change? That is how you keep the emotional animal from driving the machine off the road. The source material is exactly right on this point. Build the strategy while calm. Define rules in advance. Then, when emotion arrives, consult the rules, not the panic. Fay file site Fay turn 33 file 0 Fay. I have seen versions of this idea work in every part of life. Rules are not there because you are weak. Rules are there because moments are persuasive. And financial moments are some of the most persuasive moments in the world. Now, we arrive at something people claim to want, but rarely design for properly passive income architecture. I like that phrase from your file because it moves the discussion out of fantasy and into engineering. The average person talks about passive income as though it were a magical stream that appears once you find the right product. That is childish. Real passive income is architecture. It is a system built over time by directing capital into assets that eventually produce enough cash flow that labor is no longer strictly required for survival. Fay file site Fay turn 33 file 0 Fay. That is a very different thing. If $100,000 compounds at around 10%, it can produce roughly $10,000 a year in expected growth. That is not enough to retire most people, but that is not the point. The point is not immediate escape. The point is engine building. At 200,000, the same return rate produces more. At 500,000, much more. At a million, the mathematics begin to feel emotionally different. The structure starts generating numbers that can actually alter the necessity of work. The source material says this clearly. The goal is not to withdraw too early. The goal is to build the base, let it grow, and then over time let the income generated by the system become thick enough to change the nature of your life. Faithfully cite Faturn 33, File 0 Fay. That is exactly how I think about it. Do not ask too early whether the machine can support you. Ask whether you are building the machine correctly. That is the right order. Because people often destroy good beginnings by demanding from the engine what it is not yet built to produce. A young portfolio should often be in growth mode, not harvest mode. A maturing portfolio may blend growth and direct yield. A near independence portfolio may care much more about cash flow design. But the sequence matters. First the engine, then the output. This is where I think people hurt themselves by reaching for income too early, or for flashy products that promise yield without respecting what is actually going on underneath. They want the lifestyle before they built the capital base that can support it. I have no interest in fantasies of independence that are not supported by structure. I would much rather have an unglamorous path that actually works. Now let us address the hardest question in your source file, because it is the one that exposes the real divide between people who eventually become free and those who remain financially dependent forever. If $100,000 managed correctly can become the base of a life-changing compounding machine, why do so many intelligent, hardworking people still spend decades trapped? The answer is not intelligence. The answer is optimization. Most people optimize for the wrong variable. They optimize for income. They do not optimize for assets. That is a devastating mistake. A man earning $200,000 and spending $190,000 of it is financially weaker than a man earning $60,000 and reliably converting $20,000 into capital every year. The first man has social proof. The second man has a machine. I know which one I trust. The reference material says this directly. Most people focus on earning more instead of converting what they earn into a growing system that may be the single clearest sentence in the entire file. Fay-Phyla-Cite Faturn 33 File 0 Fay Income is not freedom. Assets are closer. Income keeps the lights on. Assets begin buying back your time. And if you confuse those two, you can spend an entire career feeling prosperous without ever becoming secure. That is one reason I have always cared more about saving rate and capital conversion than about lifestyle theater. The market does not care what car you drive. It cares what you own. The tax code does not care how rich you look. It rewards certain forms of ownership. Time does not care how exciting your consumption was. It multiplies what stayed invested. That is why short-termism is so destructive. People evaluate financial decisions by immediate feeling instead of long-term line direction. A more expensive car feels good. Now investing the same dollars feels abstract. A bigger house feels good now. Owning more productive assets feels abstract. A luxury purchase feels concrete. Compounding feels invisible. And so the mind consistently chooses the visible reward over the future engine. I do not blame people for being human. I do blame them if they never build a system stronger than that bias. The source material says discipline must be structural, not motivational. I agree completely. You cannot rely on feeling inspired to invest every month. The system must invest before your emotions have a chance to propose alternatives. Fay-Phyla-Cite Faturn 33 File 0 Fay. That is one reason I respect automation. So much automatic transfers, automatic contributions, automatic reinvestment. Automatic structure. Not because automation is glamorous, because it protects the investor from himself. Now let me pull all this together in the way I would if I were speaking to one person across a table. If you have $100,000, you are not holding a retirement. You are holding a foundation. Treat it like one. See it as a system, not a sum. Protect compounding from your own interruptions. Design risk deliberately instead of feeling your way through it. Write rules before the market asks you emotional questions. Build passive income architecture patiently rather than demanding that 100,000 behave like a million optimized for asset building rather than income theater. And above all, stop evaluating decisions by immediate pleasure alone. That is how the machine gets built. The source material closes by saying that financial independence is not luck or magic, but a structural outcome of deliberate design. That is exactly right. It is not guaranteed on any fixed timeline. But the destination is logical if the process is logical. Fay-Phyla-Cite Faturn 33 File 0 Fay. I have believed that for a long time. The market does not consistently reward the most emotional person. It does not consistently reward the most excited person. It does not consistently reward the cleverest storyteller in the room. It tends to reward the clearer thinker. The more patient one, the one who keeps friction low, the one who understands what he is building, the one who resists the urge to interrupt good structure with bad emotion. That is why $100,000 in the hands of the right temperament is a very serious amount of money. Not because it changes your life overnight, because it can begin changing the direction of your life permanently. That is worth far more than a temporary thrill. And if I were you, I would not leave that kind of possibility sitting there like a nervous possession. I would build the machine, because over a long enough life, the machine is what buys back your time. The machine is what reduces the necessity of labor. The machine is what turns effort into optionality. The machine is what lets the future become larger than the present. That is what $100,000 can be. Not a number. A launch pad. And if you treat it correctly, one day the result will look obvious. Not because you got lucky, because systems that are well designed tend to produce the kinds of outcomes they were built for. That is the logic. That is the discipline. That is the difference between hoping and engineering. And if there is one financial lesson worth carrying for the rest of your life, it may be that one. Now let me make it even more personal, because some people hear all this and think, fine, Buffett, that sounds intelligent, but what would you actually do? I would start by deciding what this money is for. If it is all the capital I have in the world and I have no emergency reserve, then part of it must first protect me from forced stupidity. That matters. The first job of a good financial system is not to maximize elegance. It is to keep you from having to liquidate at the worst possible time. If I have adequate reserves elsewhere, then the $100,000 can be given a cleaner task, long-term productive compounding. Then I would ask what kind of owner I am capable of being. Can I tolerate deep volatility without touching the system? Can I watch the market fall 30% and still behave like an adult? Can I sit through years that feel flat without inventing a new strategy out of boredom? Can I resist the urge to prove cleverness? Those are not small questions. They are the whole game. Because the best portfolio in theory is worthless if it provokes behavior that destroys it in practice. That is why I have always preferred a survivable plan over an impressive one. Survivable wins, impressive often shows off and then collapses. So no, I would not try to out Jim Simons. That is another mistake ordinary people make. They study extraordinary people and then imagine the lesson is to become extraordinary in the same way. It usually is not. The real lesson is to understand the principle and scale it to your own life. Simons treated markets like a laboratory. Good, learn from the discipline, not the mythology. Learn from the system, not the legend. For an ordinary investor, that might mean a diversified portfolio of low-cost, broad market funds, an allocation suitable to temperament, clear rebalancing rules, low turnover, automatic contributions, and the humility to accept that brilliance is less necessary than consistency. That is not glamorous. It is also closer to freedom. And there is another point in the file that deserves to be preserved because it is brutally honest. Most people do not fail because they lacked access to sophisticated tools. They fail because they would not think with precision about themselves. That is exactly right. Precision about markets matters. Precision about behavior matters more. What do you do when frightened? What do you do when excited? What do you do when a friend gets rich quickly? What do you do when headlines imply disaster? What do you do after a year of underperformance? What do you do after a year of spectacular gains? These are not side questions. These are the questions. If you know your own tendencies, you can design around them. If you pretend you will somehow become a different person in the crucial moment, the market will eventually expose the lie. That is why I want people to stop looking for financial answers that flatter them. Look for ones that endure you. That is a much better standard. A portfolio should endure your boredom. It should endure your fear. It should endure your occasional stupidity. It should endure headlines, recessions, and the urge to tinker. And if it cannot, then it is not yet the right portfolio for the owner. That is one more reason the phrase foundation matters so much to me. A foundation is not judged by how exciting it is judged by what it can hold for a very long time. $100,000 can absolutely be that sort of foundation, but only if you stop asking it to deliver emotional drama and start asking it to support an engineered future. That is the real shift. And once you make it, something remarkable happens. The account becomes quieter, the decisions become simpler, the temptation to chase becomes easier to spot, the need to impress begins to fade, the compounding line, which once felt too slow to care about, starts feeling like the most reassuring thing in your life because it is no longer abstract. It is yours. You built it. You protected it. You allowed it. You did not interrupt it to satisfy an emotional impulse. You did not convert the system into a series of expensive reactions. You let the machine run. That is what freedom looks like long before it looks glamorous. It looks like patience. It looks like rules. It looks like capital being treated with respect instead of anxiety. It looks like a person who understands that the point is not to feel rich for an afternoon. The point is to become structurally harder to corner. That is the final sentence I would leave you with, $100,000. Managed correctly does not merely make you wealthier, it makes you harder to corner. And that, in the end, is what financial freedom really is.